distinguished members of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, representatives of indigenous peoples and member states, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to make my second report at this 15th session of the Permanent Forum. I am now entering the third year of my mandate as the Special Rapporteur, as I was appointed to this post in June 2014. Today, I will give updates on what I have done to implement my mandate after I reported to you last year. This covers the four main areas of work, which include country visits, responding to cases of alleged human rights violations, promoting good practices, and doing thematic studies. I will put more stress on my country visits and thematic studies. This can provide you some information which may be useful in implementing your mandate to raise awareness and promote the integration and coordination of activities related to indigenous issues within the UN system. In pursuit of our common goal to ensure more effective implementation of the UN Declaration and ILO Convention 169, sharing information between the three mechanisms enables us to better complement, coordinate, and synergize our efforts. Complementation and coordination will also strengthen the possibility of getting indigenous peoples' rights and their development priorities respected and protected in the implementation of agreements reached at the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Between 2015 to the present, I had 3 official country visits to SAPMI in August 2015, Honduras, November, and most recently Brazil, March. The reports of these visits will be presented to the Human Rights Council in September of this year. However, in the end of my mission statements, I publicly presented some of my preliminary observation on the situation on the rights of indigenous peoples in the countries. My visits to Brazil and SAPMI were follow-up visits to those of my predecessor, Professor James Anaya. At the outset, let me thank the governments of Honduras, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the Sami Parliamentary Council, and the federal government of Brazil for inviting me to undertake these country visits. Before I summarize the highlights of my visits within the period June 2014 to the present, I would like to refer to my country report on Paraguay, which I presented to the Human Rights Council in September last year. This was received very well by the government of Paraguay, and this year, one of my recommendations was implemented. According to the information I received, the Mbia Guarani community of Chero Arapoti has, after more than 26 years, finally received the title to the community lands they were claiming. I am aware that the Permanent Forum has been involved in helping develop a national action plan in Paraguay to implement the WCIP outcome document. I hope that in these efforts, you, together with UN agencies, will build upon gains like this and the recommendations contained in my report. During my country visit to Honduras in November 2015, Berta Cáceres of COPIN helped organize my visit to Rio Blanco in Tibuca, where I held a substantive meeting with more than 100 members of the community. In the end of my mission statement, I stated that indigenous peoples expressed concern about natural resource development projects like hydroelectric dams that were approved through national legislation, not previously consulted with them, such as the case of the Agua Zarca Dam. Members of the Lenca communities that have opposed the dam due to impacts on their livelihoods and culture reported grave human rights violations, including killings, threats, and intimidation. It pains me that she was assassinated in March 2, 2016, followed yet by the assassination of her colleague, Nelson Garcia in March 15. I expressed my outrage over this in a press release few days after she was killed, and I called on the government to bring the perpetrators to justice. This to me reflects the serious situation of impunity against indigenous peoples, which unfortunately exists not only in Honduras, but in many other countries as well. The killings of the Lumad leaders and activists in the Philippines, for example, is another case in the long list of assassination of indigenous activists. The recent visit I conducted in Brazil from 7 to 17 March 2016 coincided with the heightening of the political crisis in the country. I am grateful to the federal government of Brazil for inviting me and ensuring that I met many ministers, the chief justices of the Supreme Court and the Superior Court, the federal prosecutor, and some legislators. I am even more grateful that all those I spoke with found time to meet with me despite the troubling situation facing them. In the end of my mission statement, I commended the government of Brazil for a number of measures and initiatives it has taken to ensure the realization of indigenous people's rights. These include, among others, the constructive and proactive role of FONAI and the federal prosecutors, public prosecutors, despite operating in difficult circumstances, in particular, those working in local offices. However, I also expressed that in the 8 years following the visit of my predecessor, there has been a disturbing absence of progress in relation to the resolution of long-standing issues of key concern to indigenous peoples and to the implementation of Jim Anaya's recommendations. Instead, there have been extremely worrying regressions in the protection of indigenous people's rights, a trend which will continue to worsen unless decisive action is taken on the part of the government to reverse this. I noted the serious challenges facing many indigenous peoples in the country. Among these are the proposals for constitutional amendment, PEC 215, and other legislations which undermine indigenous peoples' rights to lands, territories, and resources. The stalling of demarcation processes, including 20 demarcations pending presidential ratification. The increasing impacts of mega projects or in near indigenous peoples' territories, violence, killings, threats, and intimidation perpetuated with impunity against indigenous peoples. With the political crisis coming to a head, I am even more concerned that the recent gains might be reversed and more of the violations which I have observed will be further exacerbated. Last Saturday, the extinguishment of the Ministry of Human Rights and the Ministry of Culture are very serious developments as far as respect and protection of human rights of indigenous peoples is concerned. In the end of my mission statement, I said that a perfect storm is looming in the horizon with the convergence of various developments that further entrench the interests and power of the economic and political elite to the detriment of the rights of indigenous peoples. The risk of ethnocidal effects in such contexts cannot be overlooked or underestimated. As far as my follow-up visit to Sapmi is concerned, I received information about the concerns over the increase in natural resource investments in the Sapmi region. One issue raised is the scope and content of the state duty to consult the Sami people and the need to obtain their consent for natural resource investment projects in their traditional territories. In doing these visits, my understanding of the concrete realities of indigenous peoples on the ground and the legal frameworks and actions of taken by governments have been deepened. I haven't officially visited Asia and Africa, but I was invited by the African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights to a meeting in Cameroon, which discussed the follow-up to the WCIP. This allowed me to discuss the possible opportunities for official country visits in Africa. I was also able to go to Addis Ababa upon the invitation of the World Bank to discuss the revision of the safe economic environment and social standards of the bank. I now move on to my thematic studies. In response to the recommendation of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome document, I decided to dedicate my second report to the Human Rights Council on the situation of indigenous women and girls. I noted in this report that indigenous women experience a broad, multifaceted, and complex spectrum of mutually reinforcing human rights abuses. That spectrum is influenced by multiple and intersecting forms of vulnerability, including patriarchal power structures, multiple forms of discrimination and marginalization based on gender, class, ethnic origin, and socioeconomic circumstances, and the historical and current violations of the right to self-determination and control of resources. In this report, I highlighted the links between the violation of indigenous peoples' rights to lands, territories, and resources, to violence against indigenous women. Land appropriation is not gender neutral, and indigenous women's rights interacts with violations of collective land rights. In indigenous communities where matriarchy and matrilineal practices exist, the loss of land will likewise undermine indigenous women's status and roles. The gendered effects of these violations become manifest in situations where indigenous women lost their traditional livelihoods, among others, while compensation and jobs following land seizure tend to benefit male members of the communities. The loss of land and exclusion of women can create vulnerability to abuse and violence, such as sexual violence, exploitation, and trafficking. The situation of the missing and murdered First Nations women in Canada was mentioned in my report as well. In this connection, I was invited by the academic community to attend a seminar which discussed the issue and possible architecture of a national inquiry which has been approved by the new government. This gave me a chance to speak with Minister Bennett, Minister Jody Wilson-Rabo, and the Minister of Social Welfare, who are the ones assigned to take the lead in undertaking and designing the architecture of the national inquiry. I was also invited in a seminar in Guatemala during the trial of the Kitche Maya women of Sepor Sarco against the military men who raped them and made them sexual slaves. I had the privilege of attending the trial and also speaking with the survivors. One of my conclusions is that indigenous women face various intersecting forms of discrimination, which makes them vulnerable to sexual violence, sexual slavery, and other grave human rights violations. Solutions to these problems must be based on an understanding of the histories, cultures, and other specific circumstances faced by indigenous women as members of indigenous peoples and communities. The damages suffered happen at an individual and collective level, and likewise, the measures that must be taken to remedy the violations need to have individual and collective focus depending on each circumstance. Due to lack of time, I'll just summarize briefly the two other thematic reports that I made. I made a report on investments and the impact on human rights of indigenous peoples, which I presented to the General Assembly in October of last year. This looked into the issues of indigenous peoples insofar as our investments are concerned, and I looked at all the investments in natural resources, such as mining, infrastructure development, such as dams, and agricultural expansion of agricultural plantations. I would like to also tell you that I will have a report on conservation and the impacts on indigenous peoples' rights. And I had meetings with indigenous peoples and conservation organizations to further feed into my report. I would like to, before I conclude, I would just like to say something about the communications that I have done. I have done several communications which you can find in my report, in my website, and I also made several press releases on the killings that have been happening, and many of these have been picked up by international press like the New York Times and the Guardian. I have made concerted efforts to engage with governments about credible information of alleged human rights violations in specific cases which I believe my intervention may be of some use. I would finally like to express my warm thanks to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for allowing me to make a report in your sessions. I did not exhaust what I want to share, but all of this will be contained in the paper that I will submit to the Permanent Forum. Finally, I pay tribute to many Indigenous leaders who have sacrificed their lives in the fight for Indigenous people's rights. These include people like Berta Cáceres, Nelson Garcia, Mr. Monyeyeri, an Ogiek leader in Kenya, Junel Campos and Sinso, the Lumad leaders and chief, among many others who remained unnamed. Thank you very much.